Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Henry Hill, the streetwise kid from Brooklyn who rose through the ranks of the mob. From running errands as a teenager to pulling off million-dollar scores, Henry lived the life most only saw in movies. Charming, reckless, and always chasing the next thrill. He moved between loyalty and betrayal, caught in a world where one wrong word could end it all. As you close your eyes, picture the smoke-filled bars of Queens, the quiet exchange of envelopes in back rooms, and the empire of crime where every favor had a price. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And also, like this video. Your support truly keeps these untold stories alive. Now settle in and let the restless life of Henry Hill carry you into the night. Henry Hill was born in Brooklyn in 1943, to an Irish father who worked hard and a Sicilian mother who held the family together with long days and steady hands. Their house stood near the line where Brownsville met East New York, a place of stoops, shop fronts, and long blocks of brick. Across the street, cabs came and went at all hours from a taxi stand tied to the crew of Polvario. That corner was a stage for boys who paid attention. Henry paid attention. He was not a strong student. Classrooms felt small to him. He liked motion and noise, the rush of the street, the grace of men who knew how to walk through a door and make a room bend toward them. He began running little errands for the cab stand before he was a teenager. Coffee runs, sandwiches, a message from one storefront to another. He swept floors, washed cars, fetched newspapers. He made himself useful. He watched, listened, and learned that reliability counted more than talk. The Vario crew looked like a neighborhood success story to a kid who wanted to belong. Paul's brother, known to everyone as Tuddy, barked orders from the door. Drivers leaned on fenders and swapped jokes. Henry learned to keep times, to pass a number, to collect a small bet without making a scene. The work was illegal but quiet. To a boy who had felt invisible, the attention felt like warmth. A sandwich put in his hands, a nod from a man who mattered, a place to stand where his name meant something. He learned early that being useful meant being discreet. When police came by with questions about who parked where or who owned a certain car, he answered with shrugs or silence. His first arrest came young, a small case tied to running goods that were not meant to be in certain hands. He did not panic. He kept his mouth shut. Older men made bail appear, and afterward they clapped him on the shoulder and told him he had done right. That moment branded him. In his world, loyalty was a ladder. By the late 1950 seconds, he was a fixture at the cab stand. He knew which bars paid for protection and which owed past due bills. He delivered envelopes. He moved cases of untaxed cigarettes. He made introductions. None of it looked like movie action. It was phone calls, errands, long afternoons in diners. He learned to spot risk. He learned when to smile and when to let someone else do the talking. He learned that money came from many directions: gambling, loans, trucking, the airport, and that a smooth face and steady tone could be more powerful than a raised fist. He met older hands who shaped his path. One was Jimmy Burke, a careful thief known for his calm, his planning, and his generosity when a score went well. Jimmy taught him that patience beat nerves, that headlines were trouble, that a man who flashed cash was asking for a raid. Another was Tommy DeSimone, younger than Jimmy but quicker to take offense, quicker to push a point. Henry sat in cars with them, ate late-night plates of pasta in neighborhood joints, and felt like a junior partner in something big. He could not be a made man because his father was Irish, and in that world bloodlines mattered. But he could be trusted, and trust was its own currency. At 19, he put on a uniform. He served in the army for a stretch and found that life on base had its own black market. He hustled a bit even there, moving tax-free items and favors, never pushing too far, never drawing heat. Service hardened him and gave him time to think about what he wanted. What he wanted was waiting back home. When he returned to Brooklyn, the cab stand door swung open for him like he had never left. He met Karen on a double date in the mid-1960 seconds. She was sharp, direct, and unimpressed by the small-time swagger of neighborhood guys. Henry liked that she challenged him. He took her to busy rooms where he slipped cash to doormen and walked right to the best table. He also took her to quiet places where they could talk about family, about leaving the city for a day to breathe. They married in 1965 and started a family. Henry bought suits. He moved his mother out of a crowded apartment. He gave out envelopes at holidays. He told himself he was building something. His work deepened. He collected debts for bookmakers and loan sharks. He watched over a couple of bars that paid the crew for security, which in practice meant keeping trouble away from owners who didn't want the wrong faces hanging around. He learned to keep tempers cool at doors, to diffuse fights before they got loud. He did favors for union men and truckers, connecting requests to the right hands. He helped arrange insurance situations, sometimes involving fires set when no one was around, to solve problems for people who could not see another way out. Every favor folded him deeper into the fabric of a world that paid well and punished mistakes. Air cargo started to draw his attention. The airport, first Idlewild, then renamed for President Kennedy, hummed with freight. Warehouses held cash, jewels, fur, electronics, all moving through on tight schedules. Information mattered there more than muscle. Which guard was bored? Which shift left a door cracked? Which courier came late? Henry earned a place in the crews that watched those patterns. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the man who connected people, who carried a message, who made sure the right faces nodded at the right time. In 1967, he joined a theft from an Air France cargo building that turned into his first truly large payday. The plan depended on inside help and careful timing, not fireworks. They slipped in, took what they came for, and left before anyone knew to look in the right place. Newspapers would later call it a heist. For Henry, it felt like a confirmation of everything he had learned. Keep your voice low, keep your head down, and let timing do the heavy lifting. He went home with more money than he had ever seen at once. He put some of it toward his family, and some into the business of being seen as reliable. He did not buy a fancy car that week. Jimmy had taught him better. He spent his days at neighborhood hangouts where the crew met dealers, truckers, and bookmakers. One of those spots was a lounge tied to Jimmy, a place where laughter covered serious talk and backroom whispers set the agenda for the week. Henry placed bets for regulars, delivered winnings, and made sure no one felt cheated. When there was trouble, he smoothed it over. If smoothing failed, others stepped in. Henry knew his role. He stayed away from the headline crimes that drew cops like moths. His skill was making money move quietly. Not every job stayed quiet. Trucks vanished off highway shoulders. Cargo that should have rolled into a terminal rolled into a garage owned by a friend of a friend. Henry did some driving and a lot of coordinating. He reminded drivers which routes were safest. He made sure goods changed hands in places without cameras. He didn't carry a gun in his belt to feel tough. He carried himself like a man who knew the exits and had a reason to leave before closing time. The law came around enough to make his heart race. He learned to recognize unmarked cars. He learned to feel when a conversation in a diner had shifted from friendly to dangerous. At home, Karen saw the signs of a life built on corners. She saw the late nights, the unexplained cash, the new suit that appeared after a good week. She also saw him as a provider who did not lean on her with excuses. He took her to places where waiters greeted them like old friends and where bands played their favorite songs when they walked in. He crossed lines, but kept his voice soft at home. Their house filled with baby cries and arguments and reconciliations. He held the kids and told himself he would never let danger touch them. The truth was that danger did not care about good intentions. Henry operated in a world where grudges lasted and where power was enforced. He helped enforce it with quiet pressure and occasional shows of force that stopped short of the worst things he saw others do. He was present after assaults he did not start, helping people get moving, helping to hide evidence that would have pointed at faces he needed to keep safe. He did what was asked because he had built his identity on being a man who delivered. If a friend needed a car moved or a stash relocated, he did it without chatter. Those favors added up to crimes that could have ended his freedom at any moment. He also learned the limits of his station. Because of his Irish blood, he would never be made, never be initiated as a full member of the family that sponsored his work. That fact kept him both protected and precarious. He was useful, so he stayed. He was not fully inside, so he always had to give a little more to keep his spot. He compensated with hustle. He was an organizer, a connector, a man who could take a call at noon and have a solution by midnight. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, his name carried weight in rooms that mattered in his corner of New York. He had survived arrests, done favors, and paid dues that were measured in cash and years of loyalty. He could walk into a restaurant and be shown to a table with a grin. He could call in a favor to help a neighbor. The cost of those privileges did not show up on a receipt. It showed up in the way he slept lightly, with one ear open for the knock that might be police or might be a friend in trouble. He did not see his life as glamorous. He saw it as normal for a man from his block. When friends from school drifted into factory jobs or left the city, he stayed and followed the road that ran past the cab stand door. He told himself he had chosen community over safety. He told himself that the line between helping people and hurting people was clear. It was not clear. And it would grow blurrier with every deal he made and every envelope he stuffed into the inside pocket of his jacket. Airports still tempted him. He had tasted the rush of a clean score and liked how it set up months of calm. He introduced people who knew how to read the rhythm of a terminal. He stood on cold nights near chain-link fences, hearing the low thunder of jets, imagining all that cargo stacked behind steel doors. He thought of inside men who needed money and outside men who could promise a cut. He paced himself because patience kept him out of prison. But patience could not slow time. The city was changing. The money was getting bigger. So were the risks. The men around him were changing too. Some drank too much. Some let anger make decisions. Some grew cautious as families grew. Henry positioned himself close to the steady ones, especially Jimmy, whose rules, no headlines, no chaos, no loose talk, matched the way Henry thought about survival. He saw that the men who lasted were the ones who treated crime like a business and fear like a cost to be managed. He thought he could manage it forever. One evening he left a meeting near the airport with the winter air cutting through his coat and the sense that he was standing at the lip of a bigger life. He had stepped from errand boy to trusted hand. He had money in his pocket, respect on his name, and doors that opened when he reached for them. He also had a blind spot. He believed the next season would be like the last, only richer. He believed he could keep balance on a path that had dropped many men before him. He believed he could hold family in one hand and the street in the other, and never drop either. New jobs lined up. New schemes waited in the chatter of lounges and the hum of payphones. He had contacts at the airport and in the unions. He had debts to collect and quiet guests to settle in back rooms where no one took notes. The stakes were rising. He could feel it. He pulled tight the knot of his tie, stepped into a car, and told the driver where to go. He always knew where to go. That was his gift and his problem. The months after the Air France score taught him how quiet success could feel. There were no headlines with his name, no long sirens outside his door. Only the soft hum of a life that suddenly cost less effort. He put money into places that helped business look respectable. A lounge in Queens took his time and attention. He paid vendors on schedule, greased the right palms, and made sure bartenders knew the regulars by drink and by mood. Nights filled with laughter that masked negotiation. He learned that a well-run room could be a bank, an office, and a sanctuary at once. Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park became another hub. Jimmy Burke treated it like a headquarters without signs. Trucks, bets, favors, messages. Everything had a rhythm, and Henry was part of the band. He stood in doorways and read faces. He moved from table to table, setting up future deals in sentences that sounded like small talk. If a driver felt spooked, Henry found him a safer route. If a bookmaker had a short week, Henry extended credit and made sure the pressure stayed firm but not cruel. He helped tune a neighborhood machine so it ran without squealing. Home changed because of that machine. Karen decorated with pride. New furniture, better clothes, gifts for relatives who had carried them through leaner days. They did not talk about where every dollar came from, but silence had its own language, and both understood it. He gave, she asked for steadiness, and their lives moved forward. He also made mistakes that strained their marriage, late nights that were not only for business, attention that drifted toward other women, things he later admitted were selfish. He tried to balance contrition with denial, and often failed at both. Work grew larger as the 60s turned. Cargo jobs multiplied. He helped plan a string of truck hijackings that felt, in the crew's calculus, like low-risk, high-yield errands. Drivers usually went along. Insurance covered losses. The real danger lay in sloppy timing or showy spending afterward. Henry kept his cut discreet and his movements predictable. He would leave a room before a joke went sour. He would cancel a meet if a face at the bar felt wrong. He treated caution as a craft. Gambling money rolled through him constantly. Numbers, horses, football cards, casino markers. He held debts in his head like a ledger and collected with patience that frayed only when lies piled up. Most weeks required no more than a stern look and a reminder that missing payments made problems multiply. Once in a while, a stronger message went out. He stood nearby while someone else raised a hand or a voice. He didn't relish those moments, but he accepted them as part of a job that depended on fear as much as on trust. He kept his own temper on a tight leash, believing that men who shouted were easier to spot in a rearview mirror. By 1969, he had a share in a Queens club that drew a mix of locals and traveling faces. The door crew knew who to wave in and who to stall. The room had nights that felt like victory laps. Old friends came home from prison sentences and were treated like returning champions. To a point, respect was a current that could turn. It turned one summer night in 1970 when a tough Gambino associate people called Billy Bats came to celebrate his release. He joked, loud and cutting, about Tommy's past as a teenage shoe shiner. Word choice matters in rooms where pride is currency. The joking slid into insult. Tommy's face went blank, which Henry had learned meant a storm was forming behind his eyes. Henry tried to redirect the night, to move people to a different table, to put a quieter record on the turntable. The storm broke anyway. Violence exploded in the back room. Henry didn't throw punches. He locked doors, turned up the music, and then helped with the mess that followed. Later, he helped move a body to a place where it was not expected to be found. The incident chained him tighter to men who could not let that night become public, and it pulled him closer to a line he had long tried not to cross. That year also brought another moment that stuck in him like a splinter. A young waiter everyone called Spider mouthed off during a card game. Tommy shot him in a burst of reckless anger. Henry had watched hundreds of arguments end with laughter or grim grudges, but this one ended with a dead kid on the floor. He felt the room's air change. Even the hard men fell silent. He talked less around Tommy after that, measuring every word, sensing how quickly a joke could go rotten. He knew then that loyalty had to make room for survival instincts, even among friends. His businesses took hits too. A lounge that had been a friendly headquarters became unsustainable after law enforcement pressure and neighborhood heat made it risky to maintain. An insurance claim followed a late-night fire that left no injuries but cleared a ledger. He had a way of turning setbacks into resets, a talent that kept him afloat through storms of his own making. Trouble traveled south in 1970. A gambler with overdue markers fled to Florida, hoping distance would cool tempers. Distance solved nothing. Henry flew down with Jimmy to insist on repayment. The confrontation drew attention. Local police took an interest, and prosecutors decided to make an example. Indictments came, and although appeals and adjournments delayed the endgame, the case hung over Henry's head until it landed with weight. In 1974, he was convicted on extortion charges tied to that trip and given a 10-year sentence. The number sounded like a door slamming shut. He sat in a cell and listened to a world he had helped build continue without him. Prison had its own economy. With help from friends and family, Henry made his life inside more bearable than most. Food came in. Money moved. Guards did small favors for men who knew how to show appreciation without creating a scene. He cooked in a cell block kitchen with other inmates who had grown up on the same streets. He stayed busy because idle time brought despair. He also networked because his future depended on staying useful. He met men who ran drug pipelines and learned the margins on cocaine and pills. He took notes in his head. He also knew that Paul Vario hated narcotics, considered the trade a trap that ended in long bids and federal attention. That conflict profit versus house rules would define his next chapter. Karen did her best to keep the family steady. Visits kept him grounded and shamed him in equal measure. He missed birthdays. He missed the daily life that turns a father into more than a voice on a phone. He planned a comeback that would pay for lost time. He told himself the drug business would be a temporary boost, something to set them up, something he could keep far from the people he loved. He believed he could compartmentalize what no one he knew had successfully compartmentalized for long. He served a little under 4 years before parole brought him back to Queens in 1978. Freedom felt strange. The old corners were still there, but some faces were gone, locked up or lost to street politics. He stepped back into Robert's lounge like a man easing his weight onto a dock after a rough crossing. Jimmy greeted him with the warmth reserved for reliable partners. Paul took stock. Henry showed deference, handed over envelopes, and asked for assignments that would reconnect him without drawing headlines. Work appeared immediately. Collections, introductions, small slices of bigger operations. He was valuable again. He also started a side stream his mentor would not have approved. He met suppliers through old acquaintances from prison and began moving cocaine and quaaludes in quiet transactions that, taken one by one, looked modest, but together formed a river. He kept those accounts separate from his crew duties. He rented apartments under other names, hired a woman he trusted to cut product and field calls, and ensured that payphones were used more than house lines. Secrecy was currency. He told himself the rules were different now, that the world had shifted while he was away and that he was only catching up. Air cargo still pulled him like a magnet. The airport had grown busier. With that growth came sloppiness and vulnerability. He maintained contacts among ground crews and freight handlers who drank in the same places after shifts. Rumors of a particularly rich target began to circulate. A bookie Henry knew kept mentioning an inside man at a foreign carrier who had debts he could not pay and knowledge he could sell. Henry listened. He pressed gently. He learned enough to bring the outline to Jimmy, who had a gift for turning sketches into blueprints. The idea was audacious, a haul in the millions, far beyond the Air France grab that had once felt like the top of a mountain. While that possibility took shape, day-to-day jobs filled his hours. He managed a Shylock's book, extended credit to steady bettors, and intervened when bruised egos threatened to turn routine business into vendettas. He calmed hotheads with humor and rewarded informants who kept him a half step ahead of raids. Police attention never disappeared. He felt it in the way an unmarked car idled a block too long, in the questions that jumped a little too quickly to topics only insiders should know. He changed routes, skipped obvious rendezvous, and kept cash in places even Karen never found. Home life swung between comfort and chaos. He tried to be present for his kids, driving them to school when he could, showing up for milestones, fixing things around the house to prove that he could be an ordinary husband on ordinary afternoons. Then a call would pull him back to the life that only felt ordinary to men who had never known anything else. Karen sensed the drug business before he admitted it. He denied it, then rationalized it, then promised to scale it back. Those promises bent under pressure and often broke. Still, love kept them circling each other, trying to make something decent out of days that were half domestic, half clandestine. Old crimes never vanished. The Billy Batts murder sat in his thoughts like a stone. Police dug up fields in Queens and asked questions that made him feel the past reaching for him with cold fingers. People whispered about whether Tommy had gone too far too often, whether Jimmy was growing more ruthless, whether Paul was losing patience with younger hands making side deals. Power inside the family shifted. New leaders rose, old names faded, but the method stayed familiar. Keep the money flowing and keep the noise down. He kept a copy of the old rules in his head: no unnecessary attention, no spectacular purchases after a score, no talking over phones that might be tapped. He still used payphones and code words, still changed cars for short trips, still backed out of his driveway at odd hours to avoid patterns. The effort wore him down, but routine promised survival. As summer turned to fall in 1978, whispers at the airport grew into specifics. A safe in a Lufthansa cargo building might hold cash flown in from overseas currency exchanges, sometimes left over a weekend when banks were closed. The staff who knew that schedule were not saints, and one of them had dug a hole he could not climb out of without help. Henry kept his language careful. He passed details to Jimmy and kept his own hands clean of the most exposed work. The plan that took shape would not require gunfire if everything went right. It would require timing, nerve, and the ability to melt back into the dark before morning traffic filled the Belt Parkway. He had survived to that point by trusting his instincts and by trusting a small circle of dangerous men. Now he would rely on both again, even as a tiny voice warned that the larger the score, the sharper the consequences. He quieted that voice, straightened his tie in a window's reflection, and walked into Robert's lounge to hear the latest update, knowing that one winter night at the airport was about to set his life on a path he could not easily step off. The call came before dawn on a bitter December morning. He sat up in the dark, phone pressed to his ear, listening to a voice that never rose above a murmur say it had gone exactly the way it was supposed to. No fireworks. No alarms that mattered in time. A door where it needed to be open was open. Bags that were supposed to be in a safe were already on the move. He poured coffee with hands that didn't shake until he set the pot down. He didn't go inside that building. He wasn't one of the men in masks. But he had put people together, kept the information flowing, checked the small things that make big things possible. He dressed without turning on a light and drove to the lounge, where the air was almost too calm for the size of the news. Inside, winter coats hung heavy on chairs. No one hugged, no one shouted. Faces stayed flat the way they did after funerals and large scores. Jimmy spoke sparingly, and repeated the one rule that had kept them alive for years. Act like nothing happened. No new cars, no fur coats, no bragging, no celebrating in rooms filled with strangers. They would wait. They would filter money through quiet channels. They would make it look like 100 small weeks instead of one impossible morning. Henry nodded along. He understood that the easiest time to get caught was when you felt untouchable. The news hit the papers within a day. The numbers seemed unreal. Millions in cash, jewelry by the fistful, all from a cargo building that had felt like a fortress the day before. Television trucks idled near fences at the airport. Reporters shouted at officials who shrugged and promised task forces. Agents from federal offices arrived with fresh notebooks and the kind of focus that ruined holidays. The city buzzed with theories. Henry watched that buzz from the corner of his eye and kept his voice lowered to a register that had never gotten him in trouble. The discipline didn't hold everywhere. Some of the men who touched the job forgot the rule or believed it didn't apply to them. A brand new car drew eyes on a block where people noticed everything. A fur coat bought with cash drew even more eyes. Word reached Jimmy, and the temperature inside the lounge dropped. Henry heard the lectures get shorter, sharper. He watched men shake their heads and say nothing, because saying nothing was safer than asking why common sense had gone missing at the worst possible time. Soon the fallout took physical shape. A van tied to the job should have vanished the same morning it was used. It didn't. Days later, it turned up in a place where it could be found. That mistake felt like a siren. Within hours of that discovery, a musician everyone knew by a nickname failed to turn up for a gig and never played another. Henry didn't ask questions he didn't want answered. He took in the silence that followed, the hard looks, the way people moved to different doors. He told himself the lesson was as old as the streets they had grown up on. When in doubt, clean up. The cleaning could be swift and cold. More names faded. A bookie who had run his mouth about introductions stopped returning calls. A driver with a taste for showy things vanished. Faces that had been sloppily happy right after the hall went missing one by one, until the lounge felt haunted even on busy nights. Henry had lived long enough around these men to understand what those disappearances meant. He also understood that staying still in his chair when someone else's chair sat empty was a decision you made with your pulse and your jaw clenched. Loyalty got measured then in quiet obedience, and in the size of the envelope you brought when someone said it was time to pay tribute. He kept doing what he did best. Grease the wheels of dozens of smaller operations that together paid his bills. Bookmaking, loan collections, quiet meetings between freight handlers and fencemen, favors for union contacts. A bit of credit to keep a reliable gambler from going to someone less forgiving. His biggest difference after that winter morning was the weight of the attention he could feel on his back. He could spot the unmarked cars without seeing them. He recognized the new guy at the bar who didn't drink and asked open-ended questions. He trained his ears for the click that could mean a tape machine was running on a phone line. He bought time with caution. He also fed a side stream that was growing too fast to hide for long. After prison, he had told himself the drug business would be a bridge to stability. Instead, it became a river he couldn't wade out of. He knew suppliers out west and in Pennsylvania who could move product without panic. He rented apartments under other names. He had a woman he trusted, take calls, cut packages, and keep schedules tight enough to minimize risk. He used payphones, switched cars, and made customers travel to him instead of the other way around. Cash came in stacks that promised safety and delivered anxiety. He used more than he should have too, just enough at first to stay sharp during long hours, then enough to turn sharpness into a jitter he mistook for alertness. At home, that jitter shook everything. Karen had lived with the noise of his life for years. But the drug business changed the tone. The hours grew stranger, the stories thinner, the calls more insistent. She found traces he tried to hide. She confronted him. He denied, then confessed, then promised to slow down. He meant it when he said it. Then a call would pull him out the door at midnight, and the promise would sit in the kitchen like a forgotten dish. He still tried to be a father who showed up for school events and bandaged knees. He still bought flowers. He still fixed the sink when it leaked. Those gestures couldn't cancel out nights when he didn't come home until dawn, and mornings when he sat at the table staring past his cereal as if a door on the far wall might open onto trouble. The past continued to press claims. The man they called Bats had been tied to a powerful family, and his disappearance years earlier had not been forgiven. In early 1979, word came that Tommy had been called to a ceremony he had wanted all his life. He dressed like it mattered, because it did. He never returned. The explanation that reached Henry later felt like a sentence without appeal. This was payback. It didn't come with a lecture about rules, just a demonstration of how those rules got enforced. Henry sat with that loss like a man holding a cold stone. He replayed years of laughter and rage and bad decisions, and remembered a kid named Spider, who had paid with his life for a joke said at the wrong time. He had always measured distances around Tommy. Now the measuring changed to a habit of checking doors and thinking 3 moves ahead around everyone. After Tommy's disappearance, Jimmy grew more careful and more severe. He tightened his inner circle and cut lines to anyone who had shown weak judgment after the airport job. He kept the mood in rooms under his control to a low simmer. Henry felt both protected and endangered by that gravity. He stayed close, brought information worth hearing, and made himself useful whenever cash needed moving or a problem needed smoothing. He also kept his own side business quiet because he knew exactly how Jimmy and Paul felt about narcotics. It wasn't morality. It was math. Drugs drew federal heat. Federal heat brought long cases that pitted friendship against the possibility of freedom. Paul's patience wore thin. Rumors traveled fast in their world, and it didn't take long for whispers about Henry's side money to reach ears that could put him on a shelf for good. Paul said the one thing he always said when a rule got bent too far: knock it off. Not tomorrow. Now. Henry nodded, swore he understood, and tried to cut back. Then bills piled, lawyers called, and he found himself putting both feet back into the stream. He told himself he could run it without making noise. He told himself the new risks were manageable. He had been lying to himself since the night he took his first small cut from a package that wasn't meant for him. He kept lying because he saw no other way to keep the life he had chosen from crumbling. Law enforcement attention sharpened after the airport score. Federal agents built teams that did nothing but chase leads tied to that one night. They sat outside lounges, followed girlfriends, tailed cousins to family parties, grabbed men on small charges, and tried to trade bond money for gossip. The big case never landed the way the headlines promised, but the pressure pushed everyone in Henry's world to make mistakes. Phones stayed in cradles longer. Meetings got moved at the last minute. Even routine collections became tense, because nervous men misread glances and too many guns rode too close to too many hands. The murders tied, at least in street legend, to that winter job continued to stack up in the newspapers and in whispers. A man found in a car, a man gone without trace, a body in a place where no one had reason to be. None of it graphic in the telling, but the pattern was plain. Loose ends got cut. Henry read those items at his kitchen table and felt his stomach go tight. He had picked a path that rewarded foresight and punished hesitation. Now foresight meant imagining himself as the next cautionary tale if he slipped even an inch. He tried to outrun that feeling with motion. He worked 3 phones through a day, moved from the airport to Queens to Long Island and back, checked on a shifting stash of cash and goods, reassured clients, pressed debtors, and kept up a constant patter that said everything was under control. He drove different cars. He changed jackets. He made small detours and watched rearview mirrors like they might tell him the future. He slept badly and woke to the sound of aircraft overhead, a normal sound in that neighborhood that nonetheless made his skin prickle. Once or twice he thought a helicopter had lingered a beat too long. He told himself that was paranoia, and then added a new route to his list, just in case. The days that used to be defined by bars and cash and laughter now included lawyers' offices and meetings with men who knew the federal rulebook. Grand jury subpoenas arrived with polite covers and heavy meaning. He walked into rooms where he was expected to talk and said as little as possible. He asserted rights. He let counsel do the speaking. He walked out and felt lighter for an hour, then heavier when he remembered that papers didn't stop other kinds of pressure. He paid fees he didn't like paying and told Karen it was for the accountant, or the insurance, or school. Half-truths wrapped in calm voices were as much a part of his toolkit as an extra set of keys. He still looked for legitimate fronts that could dim the glare. He put money into small places that made sense to anyone not looking closely. A club, a bit of a restaurant, a vending route. He showed up and shook hands, and acted like a man whose calendar filled with the ordinary worries of permits and deliveries and staff. The public life helped, but it couldn't erase the private arithmetic that kept him working nights at a pace that drained him. Everything cost more than it used to. Nothing felt safe for long. Within his marriage, storms came faster, cleared slower. He had a mistress for a stretch, an apartment that functioned like a hideout, and a second stage for the lies he told himself. Karen found out the way wives in that world usually did. Fragments of stories that didn't add up, phone numbers that didn't belong, friends who looked away when asked direct questions. There was a confrontation in a hallway that involved neighbors listening behind doors and a call to the police that left everyone on edge. He promised again. He even meant it again. But the life he had chosen encouraged compartments, and he kept building them until he couldn't keep track of what lived in which box. Money from the airport job spread in strange ways across the city, but not in Henry's pocket the way onlookers might imagine. He saw his cut. Yes, and he made use of it. But the score became a curse for some. It drew envy and fear. It made men break rules that had saved them. It gave law enforcement a permanent reason to sit on corners and stare through windshields. Henry's skill had been keeping close to the yield of plans, without getting too close to the blast. For a long time he believed he had done that again. Then he realized the blast was slower this time, and that it could take years to burn through a life. By the end of 1979, he felt stretched to a thin wire. The drug business demanded constant movement. The old rackets required constant presence. The family structure he had relied on was changing under the weight of arrests, prison terms, and power shifts. He still had Jimmy, but even that friendship now came with an undercurrent he could not ignore. When Jimmy asked him to do something, Henry did it without hesitation. When Jimmy told him to avoid something, Henry backed away, without asking why. He had always been good at reading rooms. Now he read rooms like a man reading weather maps before a crossing he was not sure he wanted to make. One evening he slid into a corner booth and realized the conversation at the next table was about him. Not in words that could be quoted, but in the way two people stopped talking when he sat down and started again with safer topics. He knew what that meant. He finished his drink and left without paying, trusting that the house would understand. From then on, he adjusted the balance of his risks. He kept the most dangerous parts of his work away from places where people might be taking notes for reasons that had nothing to do with a ledger. Times when he once would have basked in attention, holidays, christenings, weddings, became times when he found reasons to be late or to leave early. He still showed his face, because disappearing unannounced meant you had something to hide. But he didn't linger. He skipped after parties. He skipped midweek dinners at crowded restaurants where a camera might flash. He chose quieter tables. He ate early. He went home when he could, even if home wasn't truly restful anymore. The months after that winter morning taught him that the biggest scores could be the ones that left you with the least peace. He had always believed he could manage risk better than the men who got carried away. He still believed it on many days. On other days, he felt like he was running downhill, trying not to trip over his own quick feet. The future was a set of moving parts, an expanding drug business that kept the lights on, an old network of hustles that needed tending, friends who were also liabilities, and a set of eyes in the sky and in parked cars that were not going away. He faced the new year telling himself that he could reset his life if he tightened every screw at once. Fewer calls, fewer favors, cleaner books at the front businesses, smaller shipments for the side money, clearer boundaries at home. Then the phone would ring, and a voice would say that a package had to be on a highway by midnight, or an account would close, that a driver had to be reassured, or he'd take his story to someone else, that a cop who usually looked the other way was suddenly looking straight ahead. He told himself he would simplify tomorrow. Tomorrow kept moving. One morning he woke, checked on his kids, and stood by the window sensing movement above the neighborhood. A helicopter thumped past at a distance that felt deliberate. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. He breathed slowly and told himself he still had time to make the right choice. He put on his jacket, pocketed his keys, and stepped into a day that asked more of him than the day before. The rhythm he had trusted his whole life was still there. The calls, the errands, the meetings. But now every beat carried the sound of a clock that no longer ticked in his favor. He moved faster and told himself speed would save him. He didn't realize yet that speed would be the thing that made him stumble. By the first warm days of 1,980, he had become a man who lived by lists. Calls to return, packages to move, people to placate. A quiet meeting at a diner by the airport. A stop at his mother's, where he kissed her cheek and promised he was eating properly. A swing past a garage to look at plates on a van that, to anyone else, would have looked like any other van. He kept everything moving, because the minute anything stopped, panic crept in. He had chosen a life where motion covered risk. Sleep came in pieces. He dozed in chairs and on couches, woke at odd hours, and started the next round of errands with coffee brewed in kitchens that weren't always his. The drug side business that had started as a stopgap swallowed his time. Couriers came and went. He checked weights and watched hands, always suspicious, always friendly enough to keep people calm. He paid attention to the smallest behavior that might signal a problem. A buyer who suddenly talked too much. A driver who began asking about schedules that weren't his concern. A girlfriend who wanted to know street names she had never cared about. He had turned into a man who saw signals everywhere and pretended not to. May bled into June with heat rising off the pavement. Helicopters had always passed over his neighborhood. The airport guaranteed it. Now he noticed them like a person hearing his name in a crowd. He convinced himself that a particular machine hovering a beat too long meant something. Maybe it did. He shut the curtains anyway and told himself not to be foolish. He had lived through storms before. He could live through this one. On a morning that began too early, he put a pot on the stove for a sauce he had promised to make. Cooking relaxed him, let him pretend for an hour that his life had the shape other fathers' lives had. He stirred, tasted, added salt, then left the burner on low while he ran an errand he could not put off. Guns needed to be dropped off. He had delayed that job too long, and delays grew teeth in his world. He made a loop toward a garage, checked on a friend who was nervous about a debt, swung back to a payphone, set up a flight for a courier who would deliver a bag to Pittsburgh, then stopped at a hospital to help his brother get discharged. All of this before lunch. He told himself he could hold 5 threads at once. That belief had carried him for years. The courier he counted on to fly didn't want to leave yet. She said she needed to pick up something from her apartment, a personal item she never traveled without. He argued, then gave in. They drove back to her place while he ran another call through a payphone and reminded himself to switch cars again before dinner. He felt watched, but he always felt watched. Paranoia had become a habit that kept him from getting lazy. He told himself that was all it was. Back at the house, the sauce was still simmering. He turned the flame up for a moment, tasted, nodded, and told his brother he'd be right back. An afternoon stretched out in front of him like a track he knew by heart. Get the courier to the airport, hand off one more bag, collect a small payment that would make the week less tight, and be home before the kids were in bed. He would tell Karen he was trying. He would mean it. He didn't make it past the driveway of the young woman's building. Unmarked cars boxed him in before the engine was fully off. Doors opened fast. Jackets moved in a way he had learned to recognize. Badges flashed. Voices stayed calm, as if saying you are under arrest and don't move your hands were as ordinary as asking a man for the time. He froze, then told himself to breathe. He had rehearsed in his mind how he would handle this moment if it ever came. Cooperate. Keep your mouth shut. Ask for a lawyer. Don't try to be clever. He followed that script. The day changed anyway. The charges focused on narcotics, conspiracy, added weapons counts because of the guns he had delayed delivering, and a line about flight risk that made his stomach flip. He sat in a room with no windows while detectives did their work, phones ringing, forms filled out, a steady hum that told him his life had tilted. They had a warrant for the apartment he used as a cutting spot. They had been listening to some calls. They had a list of names they wanted to connect. He said his name, and not much else. When asked if he wanted to make a statement, he declined. When they asked where he'd gotten certain numbers, he shrugged. He knew how to do this part. Later that day, bail took shape with calls to family, to a lawyer who had met him in too many quiet rooms in too many courthouses, to a bondsman who didn't ask for explanations. He walked out of the precinct after dark into air that felt different, like the humidity had thickened while he was inside. Karen was waiting with eyes that contained fear and anger in equal measure. He leaned in to kiss her. She didn't lean back. They drove home without the radio on, listening for their own thoughts. Sleep was a joke that night. He paced, stared out a window, sat, stood. Before dawn, he went to see Jimmy. The older man's welcome was warm in words and chilly in temperature. Henry felt it before a sentence ended. There was concern, but there was calculation inside that concern. Jimmy said the right things: lay low, keep quiet, stop with the narcotics, let the lawyers handle the rest, but his eyes told a different story. He teased out details without looking like he was teasing, drew timelines, assessed damage. At the end of the conversation, he suggested a small errand in Florida that Henry could handle quickly to settle a separate matter. The request sounded simple and wrong at the same time. A trip out of town, alone, right after an arrest that had lit up phones across the city? Henry nodded like he would consider it. Inside, he felt a cold thread spool out along his spine. He also went to see Paul. The older capo had no patience for drug business and said so. He'd warned Henry before. He warned him again with a tone that made it plain these were not suggestions. Henry had to stop, and he had to stop now. He agreed, promised, offered to bring in every connection he had made in that arena so the crew could set terms and reorganize. Paul wanted results, not plans. When Henry left that meeting, he understood that the ground under him was gone. He had broken a rule that mattered, a rule the old guard believed separated manageable risk from disasters that brought the federal government to your table and never left. He drove aimlessly for an hour, turning up streets he had known since he was 10, past the cab stand that had been his classroom, past the homes where men he admired had eaten Sunday dinner. He saw his own name in the mirror and tried to figure out which version of himself he had left to play. If he stayed, he faced prison on drug charges that weren't small. If he ran, he'd be running from men who had spent their lives studying how to find people. If he cooperated, he would be cutting himself off from everything that had given his life shape. He thought of his children asleep in their rooms and of Karen's eyes when she looked at him that evening. He thought of all the bodies that had fallen after the airport job and of Tommy's promised ceremony that had turned into a funeral nobody got to attend. He thought about Jimmy's invitation to Florida and heard in it the polite tone used when a trap is being baited. He called a number a detective had handed him at the station, a number for a federal office in Brooklyn that had jurisdiction over a long list of things that touched his world. A prosecutor picked up. The man had listened to lies for a living and had a voice like a dentist telling you the truth about your teeth. Henry asked for a meeting away from public places. The man didn't say yes right away. He asked what Henry had to offer. Henry named names in an order that made his chest tight. Airport lines, union connections, hijackings that never reached the news, a gambling scheme that had touched college basketball, extortions that looked like friendships, until you looked closely. There was a pause. The prosecutor said, "Come in," he told Karen. She stared at him for a long second, then agreed. The choice was brutal and simple. Keep living inside a shrinking circle until someone closed it, or jump. They drove to a federal building with the sense of stepping onto a stage. Elevator doors opened. A conference room appeared with coffee, notepads, and faces that showed no surprise. He told his story from the beginning, in a voice he tried to keep steady. He gave them the map of his life. The cab stand, the cigarettes without tax stamps, the first arrest in silence that earned him respect, the airport teams, the Air France theft, Robert's lounge, the way envelopes moved at Christmas, The structure of bets that flowed through bookmakers tied to his crew. The credit that kept gamblers alive and in debt. The fires that solved business problems. The union officials who did favors. The night a man from a rival family insulted Tommy in a bar. The card games. The small jobs that added up to a living. He moved slowly toward recent years. The cargo heists that fed the crew. The winter morning at Lufthansa. The killings that followed. The drug business he had built despite warnings. The arrests. The pressure from all sides. The suspicion that his friends were done seeing him as an asset. They asked about the college scheme. He told them how a bookmaker friend from Pittsburgh had bragged about controlling players through debt, how that brag had turned into introductions, how point spreads were managed on certain nights so money would move from one group's pockets to another's. He named players, dates, the flow of cash. He described who had met whom, which hotels, which restaurants, which handshakes. He watched the prosecutors glance at each other as they recognized pieces of a story they already had, now being confirmed by a man who had been in the rooms where plans had become games. They asked about Jimmy and Paul. He told them who had authority to greenlight a hijacking, who took a cut of which truck routes, who enforced discipline with a look or with worse, who had told him to stop with narcotics, who had tossed him a job like a lifeline one day and a leash the next. He told them what he had seen and, as carefully as he could, what he had only heard. He held back gossip and gave them the things he knew could be proven. Meetings, dates, deliveries, nicknames associated with paperwork, businesses that had paper trails. He might have been saving his own life, but he also knew he couldn't afford to sound like a storyteller. He had to sound like a ledger. The meeting stretched on. Coffee cooled. Men stepped out and came back in with new questions. He answered again and again. A lifetime poured into a few hours. Finally, the prosecutor leaned back, looked at Karen, and said that if Henry was serious, they would move him immediately. It would mean new names, new states, new rules. It would mean cutting off people he had known since childhood. It would mean never walking into certain rooms again. Henry nodded. Karen nodded. They signed papers they didn't read closely, because reading closely wouldn't change anything. The first moves were practical. Agents came to their house, made calls to schools, packed small bags, and put the family into cars with plates that did not match the plates on the paperwork. They drove out of New York with a sense of relief and terror playing tug-of-war in the back seat. Miles rolled under the tires. The city receded. Highways opened. Towns with unfamiliar names flashed by. At a motel far from Queens, they slept for a few hours while agents took turns keeping watch. In the morning, the kids asked about their friends. Karen told them a story that was true enough. Their dad had work in another place, and they would all be together, and school would be fine. The version of truth a family can live with is still truth. From that day, the program gave them structure and guardrails. They met handlers who explained in crisp sentences what could and could not happen. No calls to old numbers, no letters to old addresses, no visits to the old block for any reason. Money would be provided while Henry built legal work. A new identity came with new documents. Agents fronted rental deposits, enrolled the kids, arranged for basic furniture. Moving trucks and new keys replaced the background noise of his old life. He sat at kitchen tables in places he couldn't have found on a map a month earlier and tried to picture himself as an ordinary man describing an ordinary past. He practiced his new name aloud. It sounded strange in his mouth. At night, the past came back anyway. He woke thinking he heard a car idling outside. He checked locks. He stared at the ceiling and saw the silhouettes of men he had grown up with, men who had taught him how to be useful and how to survive. Now he would survive by dismantling the world they had built together. He didn't feel proud. He felt alive. He thought about the alternative. He thought about that Florida suggestion again, and about a hallway in a bar where he had once felt danger walking toward him before it reached the door. The choice he had made was a betrayal in one direction, and a rescue in another. He stopped trying to name it and concentrated on the next step he had to take. Federal agents kept him busy. He sat for days of debriefings that drilled into details, the kind that make a case stand up in court. He went through arrest records he remembered only as gossip and turned them into dates. He pointed at photographs. He matched faces to nicknames to real names. He drew maps of the airport cargo area from memory, marked guard posts and patterns. He described how envelopes moved on holidays. He explained how a trucker could be persuaded to pull over at a certain shoulder for a few minutes while a friend borrowed a load. He talked about how money got laundered through neighborhood businesses and through places with neutral names that no one would notice if they disappeared. The agents cross-checked everything. When he said a card game took place at a certain apartment on a Thursday, they found utility records that proved lights were on. When he named a restaurant, they pulled credit card slips of men who had no obvious reason to be there together. When he said a certain man disappeared after the airport score, they adjusted their own charts, because sometimes the street's timeline beat the scoreboard on a detective's wall. He watched them build a web from the pieces he handed over, and understood that the net was headed toward the men he had admired and feared most. News clippings filtered into his new life like letters from a distant relative. A former college player was indicted on point-shaving charges. A bookmaker in Pittsburgh cut a deal. A domino line stood up and began to fall. In another set of headlines, federal agents took a bow for pressure they had applied at the airport after the winter robbery. The biggest case slipped through their fingers, but the pressure had pried open other doors. People were arrested on weapons counts, on tax evasion, on stolen property, on smaller extortions connected to larger names. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a movie. It was law enforcement pushing at every seam they could reach and seeing which ones split. Henry's role moved from conference rooms to witness lists. Prosecutors prepared him for questions that would try to make him look like a man who couldn't be trusted. He was a criminal. He had lied for a living. Why believe him now? They taught him to answer by refusing to decorate anything. Yes, he had committed crimes. Yes, he had lied. He was telling the truth now, and the rest of the evidence would prove it. He practiced saying this without getting defensive. He practiced saying it without adding more than the question required. He had always been good at keeping his face calm. Now that talent would serve a different master. Back home in their new town, the family adapted in small ways first. Karen shopped at unfamiliar stores and learned the rhythm of a place where nobody talked with their hands the way people did in Queens. The kids learned new school mascots and new ways of answering questions about where they were from, without tripping over old names. Henry tried a few clean jobs, work he never thought he would do, simple shifts that paid cash and asked nothing of him but punctuality and effort. He found that an honest day could be as exhausting as any run he had ever made through 3 boroughs. The difference was the way he slept after. Some nights he managed real sleep. Other nights he lay awake listening to the old city inside his head. Every so often a handler would drive up to the house and ask him to pack a bag again. A hearing in New York. A meeting in a city where someone else had decided to talk. A grand jury room, where he would be asked to identify handwriting or a face. He flew under names that were not his, sat in cars with shades pulled down, walked through side doors so that nobody in a hallway could take his picture. In those moments, he felt the old rush. The stakes were just as high. The cause was different. He told himself he didn't miss the other life. He missed the certainty that came from knowing the rules, even when the rules were written in the way men looked at each other across a table. The past had taken decades to build. Undoing it would take years. He knew that. He also knew he had reset his life in a way that few men in his old world ever did. The price was exile. The reward, if there was one, would be measured in birthdays he would get to see, and in mornings when the phone didn't ring with an emergency he had created himself. He held on to that idea. He learned the streets of a small town where nobody cared about the airport, and where the loudest thing at night was a train whistle. He answered to a name that still felt new and set his sights on the next day, and the next, acting like a man who was finally ready to live without the sound of doors opening for him just because of who he knew. Courthouse hallways had their own smell, a mix of paper, polish, and coffee that had been reheated one time too many. He sat on benches with his hands folded and watched lawyers walk by with rolling briefcases and the look of people who had decided to live inside rules. Marshals spoke to him in low tones, ran through schedules, reminded him about simple things that mattered. Answer only what you're asked. Keep your voice steady. Don't try to fill the silence. He nodded and went where they pointed. The rooms changed. The task stayed the same. Tell them what you did. Tell them what you saw. Don't add color. Let the facts do the work. He took the stand first in a case that didn't look like much from the outside. A few basketball games, point spreads that had shifted in ways a trained ear could hear, small bets that turned into large weeks. In truth, it was a doorway into how money moved when men decided that competition could be nudged. He explained how a bookmaker with charm and debts had connected him to college kids who did not understand how heavy a favor could get once it crossed state lines. He described dinners in hotel restaurants where smiles covered worry, phone calls placed from payphones outside bus stations, the way odds changed a few hours before tip-off. He didn't mention glory. There wasn't any. There were payouts, and there were consequences, and he had lived long enough to recognize both. Defense lawyers did what defense lawyers do. They tried to knock his story loose by pulling at the man telling it. You were a criminal, correct? You lied for a living? Correct? You got paid for information, correct? He answered yes, yes, and watched the jury take notes. He had learned to keep his face still when insult turned personal. Years on the street had prepared him for that. In the end, the case turned on more than his voice. Records matched dates. Bets matched games. Players' movements matched phone logs. Verdicts landed. He moved on to the next room. Government teams built cases like bricklayers. One brick, then another, then mortar to hold it. His words were a line of that wall, never the whole structure. He saw how much the agents had learned even without him, how they had collected bills of lading, phone bills, bank slips, photographs from camera lenses he hadn't noticed while he was living fast. They knew the shape of his world. He gave them the heartbeat. Months bled into years. He testified about how the crew took a piece of goods that were in motion and turned that piece into cash. He explained how freight handlers could be convinced to look away for a minute. He walked jurors through the way a friendly owner paid for security that meant nobody broke his windows. He stood in a courtroom and pointed at Paul, who stared back with an expression Henry knew from slow days at the lounge. Respect had always been their language. That day it turned into distance. The jury heard about rackets that sounded like neighborhood favors until the numbers were added up. A long sentence followed. Paul went away. Henry felt nothing he could name other than the relief of a man who had picked a lane and stayed in it even when his stomach twisted. He testified about Jimmy too, not in the case everyone on the street wished for, but in cases that still cut deep. Money tied to those shaved points, a separate killing that had nothing to do with the airport and everything to do with payback and control. The government had paperwork and witnesses. Henry's memory filled gaps. Years of certainty ended with steel doors. Jimmy didn't get convicted for the airport robbery, and Henry never expected he would be. Too many of the men who could have told that story had disappeared. But prison shut that door all the same. For Henry, the past was being sorted into boxes by people who kept their desks neat. Life under new names meant regular things done in a strange key. He learned to fill out job applications without writing in the margins. He sat through safety meetings in warehouses where nobody knew what he had once earned from a day spent outside a roll-up door. He stocked shelves. He mopped floors. He took pride in punching a time clock and in leaving a shift without checking a rearview mirror 3 times before the light turned green. Some days, that pride held. On other days, restlessness won. He had spent decades being the man who solved problems by making one call. Now he was a man who had to wait for a manager to approve his lunch break. He tried to be a steady father in towns that had never heard his accent. School nights ended with homework spread across tables bought from stores where nobody used first names. He fixed leaky faucets in rentals and taught his kids to ride bikes on streets that didn't smell like the ocean. Karen pushed forward with a kind of stern grace. She learned new supermarkets and new shortcuts. She guarded the family's quiet as if it were her last possession. When strangers asked where they were from, she smiled and said, "Here." Trouble still found him. The habits he had built were not easy to delete. He drank more than he should have. He slid back into drug use that clouded days and made nights loud. Local police here and there pulled him over, wrote him up, or brought him in for things that didn't lead to prison but still led to phone calls the marshals didn't enjoy making. Each time, handlers moved him again or read him the rules once more. Each time he promised, then faltered. The program didn't exist to keep a man comfortable. It existed to keep a witness alive long enough to finish the job. Their patience had limits. He heard them creak. Still, the work with prosecutors continued. He sat for more interviews. He went back under oath when called. When he stumbled, He admitted it under questioning, instead of pretending otherwise. He had learned a new kind of survival. Give the truth in pieces that could stand on their own. Let the jurors connect them to the rest, and never embellish. His past had taught him to make stories. His present demanded that he stop. In the middle of these moves, a writer called. Friends had said for years that the details of his life sounded like a novel that had made a wrong turn into the facts. A book could set the record in order and maybe pay bills without requiring him to cross another line. He met the writer in quiet rooms and talked until his throat felt raw. He told the story from the window of his childhood to the kitchen tables where he had hidden cash, from the airport fences to the early morning arrests that made him decide to switch sides. The writer was careful, patient, and skeptical, in the way serious people are skeptical. He checked dates, asked the same question twice, and brought old articles to test memory against print. When the book came out, it wasn't a hero's tale. It was a ledger turned into sentences. Henry read it and saw his life arranged in a way that made sense and hurt at the same time. The book brought attention he had hoped to avoid, even as he had helped create it. Reporters called. People asked for interviews. Talk shows wanted a reformed gangster on a sofa, telling stories about loyalty and betrayal, as if those words were movie posters. Marshals didn't love that kind of shine. He had to balance opportunity against safety, a math he had never been good at. He said yes to a few things and no to others. He did not sit in front of cameras often. He liked radio better, where a voice could travel without a face attached. Even with all the moving and the rules and the new jobs, the old world shadowed him. He read obituaries for men he had once taken orders from at poker tables. He saw mugshots for others who had been picked up on charges that were small compared to the lives they had led. He knew the airport score remained a legend that police and reporters felt in their bones, even when they couldn't put it on a chalkboard and connect the circles with lines. He had done what he could to tell that story. Fate and silence had done the rest. The family bent under the strain. Karen had carried more than her share since the day he walked into the life across from the cab stand. Early years of witness protection may have felt like a chance. Mid-years felt like an endurance test. Trust grew thin. Patience thinned with it. Arguments filled kitchens that had never hosted a holiday with relatives because there were no relatives to invite. They tried counseling. They tried distance. They tried pretending the past had been sold with a lease. None of it solved the thing at the center. The man Karen had married had turned in his old world but had not yet learned to live fully in the new one. He battled with himself and with the pull of easy cash. Small hustles tempted him, and sometimes he took the bait. Passing a check that wasn't right, putting his shoulder behind a favor that sounded harmless and turned out to have sharp edges. Nothing at the scale of his former life, but enough to keep his handlers worried. They warned him that protection wasn't a forever promise. He promised he would straighten out. Some weeks he did. When he was called back to New York to testify again in the mid-'80s, the trip felt like a return to a city that barely remembered him. The skyline still cut the sky the same way. The neighborhood still hummed. Inside the courthouse, he felt the old heat. He took the stand and told another jury how the crew he had once belonged to pulled rent from a city without using leases. Papers stacked up. Rulings were read slowly. A man he had feared for years went down without making a speech. Another, whose temper had once set rooms on fire, faced a calendar that would run out before he did. Henry walked out of the building under a different sky from the one he had grown up beneath, one with federal lights attached, and got into a car that would take him back to a town where nobody said his real name. The years piled. The program kept him moving when necessary and let him settle when possible. He learned the geography of places he had never planned to see. He found favorite diners in states he hadn't visited until he was forced to. He stood in grocery aisles and reached for brands that reminded him of Brooklyn and found substitutes that were close enough. He missed sauce that tasted like his mother's but taught himself that memory and taste aren't the same thing. He visited the dentist under a false name and felt like a kid again, answering roll call under a nickname. The pull of his old crew faded each time a sentence arrived, or a funeral did the job of a sentence. He had lived long enough to feel survivor's guilt and survivor's relief in the same breath. He had also lived long enough to know that both feelings could be true at once. His children grew. They learned to drive on roads where winter meant ice and summer meant fireworks in parking lots behind supermarkets. They dated, graduated, and asked questions that he answered in pieces. He wanted them to know enough to keep them safe, and not so much that the past would become their burden. He worked odd jobs that added up to rent and groceries. A bit of construction here, a stint in a kitchen there, a run of sales for things nobody needed but some people bought anyway. He discovered he had a good hand for cooking in restaurants that served meals fast and hot. People appreciated a plate that tasted like someone had put care into it. He liked that feeling. It was close to the pride he had felt when he had handled a day without a single thing going wrong. The difference now was that success went home with him and didn't bring sirens. Neighborhood papers published reviews that said things like hearty and honest. He folded those pages and put them in drawers. He didn't want anyone collecting clippings about a man with his face. Now and then a patron would swear they recognized him from a picture years old. He'd laugh it off, say mistaken identity, claim he just had one of those faces. Most nights nobody looked twice. The world outside his house changed too. The 80s turned their corner into the next decade. Crime newspapers gave way to finance papers. Old unions were not the same unions. Airports had different security. The life he'd left behind still existed for some, but the cast had changed. He had become a source material for people building stories out of other people's missteps. Movies got made about the kind of life he had lived. He watched one in a small theater under a different name and recognized rooms, voices, the way men held their forks. He felt seen and erased at the same time. When he got home that night, he stood in his kitchen and stirred a pot like he had on mornings when the day had spun out of control. The sauce bubbled. The house was quiet. He looked at his hands and thought about all the doors they had opened and all the doors they had closed. He had given testimony that put men in prison and kept his own children safe. He had broken promises and made new ones. He had told himself 1,000 stories to survive, and then learned to live without stories, just dates and facts. The past hadn't gone anywhere. It had just moved into the background and let his next morning arrive without a knock. The movie changed everything and nothing at once. He watched his past walk across a screen with music and jokes, and a pace that felt like the breathless days he remembered. He heard his own lines in the mouth of an actor who had studied his voice, saw rooms that looked like the rooms where he had once counted envelopes, and felt the strange, hollow pride of a person who had survived long enough to see his worst decisions turned into art. People clapped. Critics wrote about style and structure. He went home and did the dishes. He was still the man who woke up early to make coffee and check windows. Attention arrived with the lights. Journalists called. Producers asked him to sit in studios and talk about the life. A phrase that made sense only to people who had never lived it. Marshals frowned. He was still inside a program built on quiet. He kept slipping. He wanted the money and the chance to shape his story. He also wanted to feel useful again. That combination made him careless. He missed check-ins. He gave out his real name when he should have signed his new one. He drank when he promised he wouldn't. The marshals had tolerated a lot to keep a witness alive and useful. Fame, even the small kind that follows a book and a film, was a line they didn't want crossed. Their message turned from advice to an exit. If he wanted to be public, he could be public without their shelter. Leaving protection didn't feel like a dramatic break. It felt like paperwork and a cold conversation in a government office. He walked out into a day that looked like any other and realized he had to build a life in plain view with habits that were built for shadows. He moved west, then moved again. He worked in kitchens because kitchens were places where motion and heat could keep his mind from wandering. The first time a chef yelled at him for slicing tomatoes too thick, he bit back a smile. He liked the straightness of the rule. Cut it this way, not that way, or the plate won't look right. His marriage to Karen faltered for good. Years of stress, relocation, broken sleep, and public talk about private pain did the damage that time alone could not fix. Divorce made official what distance had already done. They kept their focus on the children. He sent money when he could, called when it made sense, and tried not to make promises he couldn't keep. The kids found their own paths. They had memories nobody else in their classes could match and scars that didn't show in photographs. They learned who to trust by watching adults closely, a skill passed down whether he meant to pass it down or not. He fell back into drugs too often. Old habits scratched at the door the way they had when he lived in Queens. He would do well for months, then slide, Police in places far from Brooklyn wrote his name in reports after traffic stops and quick searches that turned up something he shouldn't have had. Judges gave fines, probation, rehab. He took the chances seriously and then wasted some of them. The cycle embarrassed him. He had told juries the truth at great cost. He had helped put away men he had once admired. He had told himself that doing that earned a chance at a clean slate. Addiction didn't care about earned chances. He tried to find work that didn't depend on anonymity. He cooked at small restaurants. He helped open a couple of places where the novelty of a name on a menu brought in customers for a season. He sold a jarred sauce based on a Sunday recipe he had learned as a boy, a sauce that tasted like warmth and home even to people who had never set foot in Brooklyn. He wrote down recipes, told stories about food as a way to talk about everything else without naming it, and packaged that effort into a cookbook that balanced two things he really understood: kitchens and consequences. He painted. At first, it was a hobby that quieted his mind after long shifts. Soon it became a second job. Canvases filled with scenes from his memory, airport lights at night, a table under a low ceiling, a street with a cab stand sign glowing in the dark. He had never thought of himself as an artist. The act of setting down a line that looked like the block where he had grown up gave him a steadiness he'd missed. Galleries hung his work. Buyers liked the backstory and the rough energy. He liked showing up with a stack of fresh canvases and leaving with a lighter car and a promise to bring more. He spoke to students sometimes, a man in late middle age standing in front of rooms full of kids who had seen the movie and wanted to hear how much of it was true. He told them that the rhythm was right and that the cost was higher than any film could show. He pointed out that glamour fades fast when you're the one paying the bills for lawyers and waking up to a knock you didn't expect. He didn't preach. He listed facts, the way he had on the stand. Money came. It went. Friends made rules that saved you until the day those rules were used against you. He watched faces in the front row and hoped a few of them would hear the part about the cost. Radio hosts liked him because he could tell a story cleanly and laugh at himself without making light of the damage he had done. He did a handful of interviews that turned into regular visits. Listeners called in to ask about scenes they loved and about characters whose names had been changed. He sidestepped what needed sidestepping and answered what he could. He was careful not to make instructions out of anecdotes. He had helped law enforcement once. He wouldn't undo that now by giving anyone a how-to guide hidden in a joke. From time to time, he returned to New York to stand in front of people again and swear to tell the truth. New cases were rare, but they came around. He would sit in austere rooms, name faces, explain systems, and walk back out into daylight thinking about the corners where he had once felt invincible. The men he had known were mostly gone, locked up or buried. The structure that had shaped his 20s and 30s had shifted, but the city had a way of repeating patterns with new names. There were seasons when he seemed to find balance. He met a woman who was patient enough to stand next to a man who had to carry the past like luggage. They set up house. He cooked, she handled the paperwork he hated, and they tried to be ordinary. He slipped sometimes. When he did, the household bent but didn't break. Stability looked like laundry, folded on a Tuesday, and a rented movie on a Friday. He never would have predicted that an average week could feel like a win. He used public attention to pay the bills without treating it like fuel. He signed books. He told a longer version of the story in another volume that focused on the years after the trials, on what it took to live under new rules and why he had stumbled. He liked the feeling of closing the loop on a narrative that had been told about him by strangers. A guide to his old city came later, part food map, part memory lane, a way to talk about neighborhoods without talking about envelopes. He walked blocks with a notebook and wrote down which places had survived and which had been turned into bank branches or salons. He understood that some people would never forgive him for cooperating. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't think in those terms anymore. He thought in days. Make this day clean, tell the truth when asked, keep away from nonsense that would pull him backward. He marked his calendar with small victories. Court dates concluded. Book deadlines met. A month without a drink. He learned the names of servers at a coffee shop near his apartment and liked the way they called him Sir. He still heard from producers who thought a sequel to his life might be a good idea. He learned to say no unless there was a reason to say yes, and the reason had to be more than a check. He consulted quietly on a couple of projects when they needed to know what a back room felt like at 2 a.m, or how a person in his world could walk through a door and read the room in seconds. He never gave them mechanics. He gave them mood. the way air changes when power walks in. Small arrests dotted the years like thumbtacks on a corkboard. A domestic argument that got loud and drew neighbors. A night when a bottle got the better of him, and a patrol car's lights turned a corner into a stage. An old reflex to hustle that crept back when rent was due, and led to a charge that went nowhere but still landed him in a cell overnight. Each incident came with a price paid in dignity, and in the patience of people around him. Each one made his handlers, when he still had handlers, remind him that the program was not a soft cushion. After he was fully out, those reminders came from friends who wanted him to keep his head down. He tried. He was never perfect at trying. He learned to like work that had nothing to do with reputation. He took a job at a small art store, mixing paint and ringing up customers who bought brushes for school projects. He answered questions from beginners with more care than he had ever expected to give a stranger. He fixed a bent frame with the same attention he had once given to a crooked schedule at the airport. He walked home in the evening with a bag of groceries and thought about dinner like a man with a simple plan. Boil water, salt it, eat, sleep. He kept in touch with a few people from old days and program days. They talked like veterans, careful with specifics, generous with the quiet empathy that comes from having seen the same rooms for different reasons. They met for coffee, never in the same place twice in a row, a habit that had become a superstition. They talked about kids, repairs, and recipes, then said goodbye with quick hugs and walked away without looking back too often. Money stayed up and down. He was never rich, never comfortable enough to stop hustling in legal ways. He sold paintings online and at small shows. He did signings at bookstores where half the audience brought a DVD case. He smiled for photos and tried to look like a man who had built a new life on purpose. He told people who asked that the ending they wanted didn't exist. There were just choices you made every day. He meant it. He visited his mother when he could, calling first, arriving with food, keeping the talk light. She had watched him choose a road she had prayed he would never take, and then watched him try to walk away. Mothers measure time differently. She looked at him and saw the boy who had carried sandwiches to a cab stand. He left those visits feeling both smaller and steadier. The old crimes remained part of public record and private memory. He didn't deny them. He didn't dramatize them. When a younger man asked him how hijackings worked, he said that the question missed the point, that the process was only the surface, and underneath the surface was a set of choices about who you wanted to be. He didn't pretend he had been noble. He did say that living to talk about it was luck and nothing more. He tried sobriety programs with mixed results. He liked the rooms and the plain way people spoke in them. He liked the idea of counting days. He would collect a handful of chips, then lose them, then start again. He didn't quit on himself, which was a kind of progress that doesn't show in photographs. The people who loved him learned to watch for signs and to step in without making speeches. When he hit a good streak, he made sauce on Sundays and invited neighbors. Food had been his language of care since he was young. It stayed that way. He carried the weight of names that wouldn't go away. Paul, Jimmy, Tommy, men who had taught him one form of survival and paid for that lesson with years or lives. He spoke about them with a mix of fondness and clarity, never unseeing the harm, never pretending there had been another easy outcome. He kept a box of clippings. He rarely looked at headlines from days when his world had cracked open, and from days when it had cracked again. He thought about throwing the box away, then kept it, because forgetting felt like lying. Years turned. He was no longer a news story. He was a man who paid rent, made dinner, answered calls from his kids, and took vitamins he didn't used to take. He got tired earlier. He still woke at odd hours sometimes, listening for sounds that belonged to a different life. Most nights, there was nothing to hear but a neighbor's television through thin walls and a train in the distance. He let himself fall back to sleep and decided that ordinary noise could be a blessing. He had spent decades outrunning the past. Now he was learning how to outwait it. By the time another decade turned, his mornings often began with a small radio blinking to life on a kitchen counter. A host out of New York or Los Angeles would patch him in, and he'd tell a lean story about a day when a package went missing or a gambler learned the meaning of interest. He kept the tone dry, brushed off praise, and slipped in the truth that never changes. Whatever thrills people think exist in that life are rented, and the bill always comes due. Then he'd hang up, wash the mug, and set up canvases in a corner where light hit just right. Paint gave him a quiet he had never found when he was young. He could stand there for hours, tuning a skyline or a storefront sign, until memory lined up with what sat in front of him. He had left witness protection for good, not in a dramatic exit, but because the small rules felt like chains, and because his own lapses made the arrangement unworkable. That meant living as himself again, a name that carried both invitation and risk. It meant the freedom to take an interview, and the responsibility to keep himself safe without handlers. He moved through apartments in California and Nevada, learned bus routes in places he had once flown over without noticing, and found diners where the waitress poured coffee without asking and didn't stare. He liked those rooms, the ones where nobody expected anything from him except a tip and a thank you. Work stayed patchwork. Some months he cooked for pop-up dinners and private parties, where curiosity brought guests through the door, and the aroma kept them in their seats. He'd plate eggplant, tell a quick story that made people laugh without giving away more than he meant to, and watch as tables leaned closer to the food and farther from the past. Other months he sold art to collectors who wanted a piece of the story as much as they wanted color on their wall. He felt two urges tugging at him: use the past to pay for the present, and refused to let the past define every conversation. He walked that line as carefully as he could. Sobriety was a fight he didn't always win. There were setbacks that made local papers in towns where the name Henry Hill still drew clicks. A traffic stop that turned into a night at the station. A small bag found where it shouldn't have been. A probation lecture from a judge who knew exactly who he was. He took those hits, walked out into daylight, and promised himself he would do better. Sometimes he did. On good stretches, he showed up early for shifts, smiled easily, ran a kitchen that hit its marks, and went home in time to sleep like a man who had earned the right to be tired. Writing gave structure to his middle years. With a reporter's help, he put together a cookbook that wasn't just recipes but also notes on the houses and kitchens where he had eaten, the people who had handed him plates, the ways a simple sauce can make a day feel like a day worth remembering. He followed that with another book that laid out the years after he flipped, what it had taken to stay alive and what it had cost to be useful. He didn't use those pages to glamorize anything. He used them to make a record for himself, a way to say, this happened and that happened, I did this, I watched that. Here is the price for each choice in plain words. He saw his kids grow into their own lives. Calls got easier when they were about regular things, jobs, apartments, vacations rather than logistics, from a program that had moved them from school to school. Trust had been a casualty of his choices. It came back slowly, not with speeches but with steady days and a calendar that didn't get blown up by his drama. He felt proud when they set boundaries and lived inside them. He had taught them to read people and protect themselves, lessons he had once used to darker ends. He tried love again. A woman with patience and humor appeared and stayed. She didn't ask for magic. She wanted honesty and a man who would be there on Tuesday as promised. He gave her that most days. They built a life out of routines, groceries on the weekend, bills paid on time, movies at home instead of bars that would ask him to perform his past. There were rough patches, because there always are. But the relationship had a sturdiness he didn't take for granted. When he stumbled, he apologized without the old deflection. Saying sorry and then behaving like he meant it felt like a new skill learned long after it should have been second nature. He spoke to students at high schools and community colleges. Teachers wanted someone who could meet their kids where they lived and say plainly what choices look like when the wrong door opens and stays open. He stood in front of those rooms with his hands in his pockets and described what borrowing from a bookmaker does to a life, how protection becomes a bill that never ends, how easy side money carries seeds that grow into years you can't get back. He never threatened. He didn't need to. He just laid out cause and effect with the authority of someone who had lived it longer than any of his listeners had been alive. He kept ties with a few people in law enforcement, not as a regular source anymore, but as a man whose memory of certain roots and customs could give context when a cold case or a new pattern needed a translator. He would take a call, answer 3 careful questions, and go back to stirring his sauce. He felt a responsibility to avoid undoing the work he had helped do long ago. He would never give anyone a blueprint to commit a crime. He would tell a detective why a certain story didn't add up, why a driver would never have taken that exit unless he was nudged, why a date on a receipt mattered. He saw it as a way to settle old accounts. Phone calls from media producers never stopped. He learned to route them through a friend who could say no without sounding offended. When he said yes, he chose settings where the conversation stayed grounded. A radio studio with a host he trusted. a documentary team that valued facts over fireworks. He liked radio because it reminded him of the kitchens he worked in, busy, warm, focused on the job. He'd answer questions about whether a movie scene matched the memory and then steer the talk back to what mattered to him. The human arithmetic of favors and fear, the way ordinary people get pulled into schemes that start small and end badly. He went back to New York now and then, not to haunt old corners but to check on his books or meet a publisher. He walked past places he had once owned a piece of, places that had been knocked down or turned into something else entirely. He would stop, look at a blank lot, and see a room that had once smelled like espresso and cigarettes, hear voices that would never come out of those doors again. The city had moved on, as it always does. He felt both relieved and a little lost, as if he had showed up late to a party, and no one remembered his name. Health began to assert itself in the ways it does when you pile up years lived hard. Doctors talked to him about diet, about cigarettes, about blood pressure that needed watching. He nodded. He tried. He cooked more fish, cut back on salt, put out a smoke halfway through once or twice and left it at that. He took pills lined up in a tray that divided the week into squares. He joked with nurses and remembered the names of receptionists, because he'd learned that remembering names is a kind of kindness that costs nothing and returns a great deal. He did short stints with rehab programs that talked about cravings and triggers in language that made sense. He recognized his patterns like landmarks on a familiar map. Holiday season. Dangerous. Big anniversaries tied to old scores. Dangerous. Boredom. Most dangerous of all. He filled the empty hours with paint, with long walks, with chopping vegetables slowly on a board that had seen better days. He rediscovered the satisfaction of making something whole out of parts, a stew that came together, a canvas that finally matched the memory in his head, a day that ended without a single lie told to anyone. He got letters. Some were from people who had read his books and wanted to say that the story made them think twice about choices they were about to make. Others came from prisons, from men who wanted to argue about honor and loyalty, to tell him what they thought of his decisions back in 1980. He read some of those, put others in a drawer. He wrote back occasionally, not to spar, but to say simply that he had chosen to live and to tell the truth, and that anyone who wanted a different ending could go find it themselves. He tried to build simple pleasures into his weeks. A certain bakery on Saturday, a farmer's market where he could talk tomatoes with a vendor who didn't know his history and wouldn't care if he did, a spot near the ocean where he could sit on a bench and listen to waves, which sounded the same in every decade and in every city with a shore. He liked being invisible in crowds, a privilege he had not enjoyed when every room he entered wanted a story from him. A few more small arrests came, embarrassments born of slipping back into old escape valves, each one chipped at the work he had done to stay clean. He took the consequences without drama, then picked up his routines again. He talked about it with people he trusted, and didn't try to outrun the truth that he was always going to be a man who had to pay extra attention to the pull of bad habits. He watched the world around him change. The city where he had grown up became safer in some neighborhoods and harder in others. Airports reinvented themselves with layers of security that would have made his old hustles laughable. The union halls where he had once made introductions didn't play the same role in a new economy. Young people made money in ways that would have sounded like science fiction when he was a teenager. He felt old in the way everyone does if they're lucky enough to get old. He let himself marvel at the pace of it all, and then went back to his canvas, where time moved at the speed of a brush. His mother's recipes kept him company when nights stretched. He would put garlic in oil, wait for the scent to bloom, then stir in tomatoes and stand there with a wooden spoon like a man minding a fire. He served neighbors and friends without ceremony, laughed when they asked for seconds, and let the room do the rest. Food had always been a social glue in his life, a way to turn a door into a welcome. He used it that way now without any other agenda. A few times he stepped onto small stages for Q&A sessions attached to screenings of the film. The audience wanted his verdict on scenes that had become part of American movie lore. He gave it in short answers that honored the craft, without pretending that cinema could carry the full weight of the years. He reminded people that the part of the story most worth remembering was that he had been given a chance to choose his family over his crew and had taken it, however clumsily. He caught eyes in the third row that held respect, and eyes in the back that held lingering judgment. He accepted both. He kept a small circle of friends who weren't impressed by any of it. They showed up when he moved apartments. They sat with him when he wrestled a stubborn craving. They didn't need war stories to enjoy a Sunday afternoon. He returned the favor by cooking, by making calls on their behalf when a landlord needed nudging, by listening when someone else's past reached into the present. He had learned how to be useful without handing over an envelope. That felt like growth nothing else could match. As the second decade of the new century began, his body told him again that it had kept score. A tightness he had ignored drifted into his chest and stayed. Doctors used words like stent and stress test, and suggested he take seriously what he had once waved away. He made jokes about being hard to kill. He also followed instructions with a discipline he had once reserved for street rules: low sodium, short walks that grew longer, pills at breakfast and dinner, checkups kept. He complained about hospital gowns like everyone does, and thanked every person who drew blood or adjusted a line. He didn't stop working, because work kept the clock moving. He signed a stack of books at a quiet store on a weeknight, and chatted with the handful of people who braved traffic to be there. He mailed canvases to buyers who sent notes back saying the colors made their living rooms feel warmer. He did a radio spot from a studio that smelled like dust and coffee, and came out into sunlight feeling lightheaded but pleased. He went home and napped like a grandparent, then woke to the phone ringing and a friend asking if he wanted to eat someplace familiar. In the spring of 2012, the warnings turned into something he couldn't walk off. He landed in a hospital where beeps and soft shoes replaced the soundtrack of his days. A nurse adjusted his pillow and told him not to worry about the time. He cracked a joke that made her laugh, and then asked for water. Friends visited. He asked after their kids, their cars, their gardens, anything but the reason he was in the bed. He didn't flinch when doctors spoke plainly. He had lived long enough to appreciate people who didn't waste words. He died that June in Los Angeles, far from the block where he had pressed his face to a window as a boy and decided that a certain kind of life looked like freedom. The cause was what the chart said it was: complications that come to men who live too fast for too long and then try to make it right. No headlines shouted. A few news outlets marked his passing with the kind of tone reserved for figures whose names people know without knowing why. Friends called each other. Old enemies shook their heads. His family grieved him as a father, and a man who had tried, sometimes failed, and kept trying. The day after, the world kept moving the way it always does. Flights took off from the airport that had once been his map. Trucks rolled past warehouses that bore no resemblance to the ones he had walked through at night. Restaurants filled and emptied. Somewhere a kid sat on a stoop imagining a life bigger than the one his parents could provide. Somewhere else, a man counted out cash and wondered whether the money would buy him time or just steal it. The story Henry had lived became a story other people would tell, argue about, read into, and read away from. He was no longer there to edit it. What remained were the facts he had put on the record, and the smaller truths that lived in the way he had tried to age with some grace. He had been a runner of errands, a mover of goods, a collector of debts, a planner who could carry 10 clocks in his head at once, a husband who broke vows and a father who kept showing up, a witness who told the truth, a man who folded napkins in a kitchen and showed cooks half his age how to chop an onion fast without bleeding. He had been many versions of himself. The last versions preferred quiet. They got more of it than he once thought possible. After he was gone, the story didn't end so much as settle into the places where stories live. In books on shelves, in court transcripts stored in boxes, in film scenes people quote to each other late at night, in radio archives where his voice sounds younger than the date on the file. Friends traded memories quietly. Reporters pulled old notes and wrote capsule obituaries that listed dates and names, as if that could hold a life. The city where he learned everything kept going. Night crews still clocked in at the airport. Cabs still idled on side streets. A kid on a step somewhere still watched men who seemed to move without friction and wondered what it would take to be like them. Time sorted the fates of the men who had shaped him. Paul Vario, the steady presence at the top of his crew, had gone to prison in the 80s after racketeering convictions and died there before that decade ended. Jimmy Burke, the planner whose rules had kept everyone rich and breathing for years, spent the balance of his life behind bars on cases tied to the college basketball scheme and a separate killing. He died in 1996. Tommy DeSimone had vanished in 1979, and word in the street had long since hardened into the explanation everybody understood without needing an announcement. None of those turns surprised the men who had grown up in that world. The road had only a handful of exits, and everybody knew where they led. The airport robbery that had bent a winter morning into legend kept echoing through headlines now and then. Agents revisited it. A grand jury decades later took a run at putting a name on it with a new indictment that brought a familiar surname into the news. A trial followed. An acquittal ended it. By then, the case had become less about punishing the guilty and more about finally giving shape to a story that had fueled rumor for nearly 40 years. Law enforcement had their paperwork. The street had its lore. Somewhere between the two sat the version Henry had given under oath, the one where he described who set meetings, who held keys, who knew the schedule, what was said in rooms that smelled like coffee and late nights. People still argued about details. That's what happens when a life has been told by journalists, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and filmmakers. He had told his memories straight as he could, and then watched as characters based on real people played out those memories on screens. The film that turned his history into a cultural language shortened timelines, changed names, and captured a truth that wasn't a record of dates so much as a record of speed and mood. He understood that difference, and didn't fuss about it. He had lived the days. The movie had captured what the days felt like. The family kept their lives private on purpose. Karen had done more than live through those years. She had carried children through moves with new names and faced down phone calls that would have frozen most people in place. After the divorce, she built a life that didn't need to explain itself to anyone. The kids became adults who valued ordinary things: steady work, steady friends, places where nobody knew them by association. They did not step forward to represent his story. They had their own to live. What Henry left behind as a public figure were records that outlast gossip. He had sat in witness chairs and testified to crimes that stretched from simple extortion all the way to large cargo thefts that bent corporate balance sheets. He had mapped how bookmaking lines crossed borough lines, how point shaving turned a game into a payday, how a union favor could become a lever, how a warehouse door left open for 5 minutes could translate into a score that underwrote months of quiet. He had admitted to collecting debts for loan sharks, to moving stolen goods, to coordinating hijackings, to playing go-between on protection rackets that looked like kindness until you added up the bills, to helping after a killing by making a body vanish and by keeping his mouth shut while the room settled, to setting up arson as insurance fixes, to building a narcotics pipeline that he had been told to avoid and had worked anyway. The hearings and trials cleaned those memories into lines and names and dates. The cases closed. Sentences ran out or ended lives. The files stayed. As the years pushed past his last one, people still asked the same questions. Why did he join? Why did he stay? Why did he flip? The answers were there in everything he had said. Belonging is a powerful gravity when you are a kid looking across the street at men who never seem to be told no. Familiarity keeps you in the room even when the room gets dangerous. Fear keeps you quiet when ambition tells you to stand close to the biggest deal you can find. Family changes the equation when danger stops being an idea and becomes a set of possible outcomes with names you eat dinner with. He wasn't a philosopher. He put it in simpler terms whenever a microphone was in front of him. The cash felt easy until it didn't. And the trade for telling the truth was that he woke up to his children's faces instead of a cell. In classrooms and lecture halls, teachers used his life to talk about cause and effect. Students listened to a story that refused to be a fable. Nothing about it was neat. He had harmed people. He had helped law enforcement hold others accountable. He had lied to survive, then told the truth to continue surviving. He had relapsed and tried again. He had helped the government and frustrated the program meant to protect him. He had steadied himself and slipped and steadied himself again. The story didn't end with redemption and a sunset. It ended where most lives end, with a body giving out and a circle of people grieving a complicated man. His later work kitchens, canvases, radio turned out to be the most ordinary, and for him, the most radical things he ever did. In those spaces, honesty looked like showing up when you said you would and doing what you said you'd do. He cut onions with the same precision he had once used to read a room. He stood in front of blank canvas and let his mind remember a sidewalk on a summer night, the way streetlights throw shadows that make a kid feel like he's walking through a movie. He waited on hold at radio stations and told clear stories without giving anyone a map to make the same mistakes. He wrote ingredients and instructions that made someone else's house smell like his mother's kitchen, and took quiet pleasure in knowing a stranger's Sunday had turned warmer because of a page he had signed. For all the attention that came with the film, most days in his last decade had nothing to do with celebrity. They were about rent and groceries and choosing a walk over a bar, about keeping the phone number of a friend who would pick up at midnight and talk him through a bad hour. He had wanted applause once. Later, he wanted the kind of week where the loudest sound was a pot boiling, and the mail brought nothing scarier than a utility bill. When he spoke to young people, that was the truth he liked best. The life that once looked like power finally just looked like noise, and the life that once looked dull felt like grace. There are myths that still cling to his name. Some of them he encouraged unintentionally, just by being the subject of a book and a classic film. Others came from the gossip economy that runs forever in neighborhoods like the one where he grew up. He can't answer those now. What's left to weigh are the verifiable facts and the human residue. Courts convicted bosses and lieutenants with help from his account. Families of victims went to court and saw someone tell the truth about rooms that had been closed to them. His own family kept living, which is not a small achievement considering the alternatives they were staring at in 1980. Those items don't balance a scale in a perfect way. They sit side by side, and each reader decides what they add up to. The city that made him is always making someone. The cab stand he haunted as a boy is gone, replaced by a different kind of business with different problems. The airport is a fortress of cameras and layers of security that would make the old games laughable. The lounges where men traded information have become restaurants with bright lights and more kinds of salad than anyone in the 70s could have imagined. The math of risk has changed, but the need to belong and to feel important hasn't. That's why people still show up to screenings to ask him, even now in the past tense, if it was worth it. The answer hides in his own late-life choices. He tried to make dinner, to pay rent, to show up, to sleep without jumping at every knock. If you track his days, that's the verdict he rendered by how he lived the last of them. When friends get together now and say his name, the stories are small and human. Someone remembers him insisting on seasoning the sauce himself at a charity event because he didn't trust the salt in the kitchen. Someone else remembers him picking up a dropped grocery bag for an older neighbor and walking her up the stairs, then spending 10 minutes praising her houseplants. A radio producer remembers that he never missed a cue. A cop remembers that he returned calls even when the answer was no. The larger-than-life angles recede. In their place are the habits of a man who, after burning through several lives, tried to behave like a person whose word counted. If you strip away the legend, what's left is a long American story with familiar beats. A kid who wants in. A young man who finds a crew. A worker who becomes a piece of a machine. A husband and father who thinks he can hold two worlds together with the force of his will. A crisis that turns the tables. A witness who trades a code for a chance at a different future. A middle-aged man stumbling toward ordinary days. An old-timer who can feel storms in his chest and finally lies back in a hospital bed and lets other people do the work. There's no moral printed at the end in bold. There is a feeling, though, that echoes if you sit with it. Choice matters. And momentum can be as dangerous as intention. In the quiet version of his story, the one he tried to live at the end, you can still see the boy at the window and the airplanes tracking night lines over the neighborhood. He followed those lights and paid for it over and over. He also turned around one day and chose a different road. That choice didn't erase anything. It did change everything that came after. If there's a comfort to be taken from the way his story closes, maybe it's this. Even a man whose name became shorthand for a kind of life can spend years learning how to make dinner, how to tell the truth, how to be on time, how to go to sleep in a house that isn't afraid. The window is still there in Brooklyn. Somewhere a kid is still looking out. The rest is a set of decisions no movie can make for you. And that's where tonight's journey through the silent empires comes to a close. Henry Hill here, grateful you joined me in revisiting the highs, the schemes, and the shadows of my world. If this story kept you company as you drifted toward rest, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment. I always look forward to seeing where these tales reach. Until next time, may the quiet of the empire watch over your sleep, and may the voices of the past fade softly into your dreams. Good night.